You are the one that is trying to save Chief. He must die. Nothing you can do about it.
The doctor said I will die soon, but I need your help before I die. There is something I need you to do for me.
Welcome to Heritage Story, your #1 folktales channel for amazing stories.
The glass vial slipped from Halima's trembling fingers and shattered against the marble floor of the master bedroom. Her heart hammered as she stared at the clear liquid pooling between the shards, mixing with the dust she disturbed while cleaning behind a mahogany dresser that had belonged to Haji Musa's ex-wife. The label on the broken vial was partially torn, but she could still make out the words written in hurried handwriting. 3 drops daily in evening tea. Her mind raced back to 6 months ago when a billionaire boss had collapsed in his study, his face pale and twisted in agony. She remembered the doctors shaking their heads, whispering about organ failure and mysterious toxins in his bloodstream. She remembered his desperate plea as he lay in that hospital bed, believing he had only weeks to live, begging her to give him the one thing money couldn't buy, a child to carry his legacy. And she remembered her own tears, her fear, her eventual agreement to bear a baby for a dying man who had always treated her with kindness when the world had given her nothing but hardship. But Haji Musa hadn't died. Against all medical predictions, he had recovered 3 months ago, suddenly and miraculously, right around the time his ex-wife Zainab had stopped visiting the mansion, right around the time Halima had discovered she was pregnant. Now, standing in this room with the evidence of attempted murder scattered at her feet, Halima realized a horrifying truth. Her boss had never been dying of natural causes, and whoever had poisoned him would not be happy to know he had survived and that she was carrying his heir. Before we dive deeper into the story of betrayal and survival, if you're loving this dramatic tale already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more emotional stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Halima's hands moved on autopilot as she swept up the broken glass, her mind struggling to process what she had uncovered in the hidden corner of the bedroom that once belonged to Zainab, Haji Musa's ex-wife, who had left him 2 years ago, claiming she couldn't bear the loneliness of being married to a man married to his business empire. The mansion in Victoria Island, Lagos, stood as a testament to Musa's wealth. 15 bedrooms, an Olympic-sized pool, and staff quarters that housed 12 employees who maintained the property. Halima had been working here for 3 years, ever since she'd fled her village in Kano State after her father tried to marry her off to a man 3 times her age. She'd arrived in Lagos with nothing but a primary school education and dreams of something better. Haji Musa had hired her despite her lack of experience, seeing something in her honest eyes that reminded him of his late mother. He'd paid for her to complete her secondary education through evening classes, treated her not as a servant but as a human being deserving of dignity. When he called her to his hospital room 6 months ago, his voice weak and his eyes filled with regret, she'd felt her heart break for this man who had given her a chance at life. "Halima," he had whispered, his hand reaching for hers with the desperation of a drowning man, "I have built an empire worth billions, but I will die alone with no one to carry my name, no child to remember me, no legacy beyond buildings and bank accounts." His word had cut through her like a knife, and she'd felt tears streaming down her face as he continued, his voice breaking with emotion she'd never heard from the usually stoic businessman. "My brothers want my wealth. My ex-wife took half of everything I built, and the vultures are already circling, waiting for me to take my last breath so they can tear apart everything I've worked for since I was a poor boy selling groundnuts on the streets of Kano." She had tried to leave, to tell him she couldn't possibly be part of such an arrangement, but he had gripped her hand tighter and said the words that would change her life forever. "You are the only person in this world I trust, the only one who has never looked at me and seen only money, the only one who has shown me genuine kindness without expecting anything in return." For 3 days she had wrestled with a decision, crying in her small room in the staff quarters, calling her best friend Amina, who worked as a nurse at the teaching hospital and who had advised her to think carefully about the consequences of such an agreement. The memory dissolved as Halima heard footsteps approaching down the hallway, and she quickly wrapped the broken vial pieces in tissue paper, stuffing them into the pocket of a cleaning apron just as the door swung open to reveal Zainab standing there in an expensive Ankara dress and designer sunglasses, her presence in the house shocking since she hadn't been here in 3 months. "What are you doing in my old room?" Zainab's voice was sharp suspicious, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for something missing, and Halima felt the weight of the vial fragments pressing against her hip like burning coals. Halima forced her voice to remain steady even as her pulse raced with fear, responding, "Just cleaning. Madam, Haji Musa asked me to prepare all the rooms for proper maintenance since the rainy season is coming, and we don't want mold or damage to the furniture and fixtures." Zainab's perfectly painted lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, and she stepped further into the room, her expensive perfume filling the space as she moved closer to where Halima stood frozen near the dresser. "How thoughtful of him to suddenly care about maintenance," Zainab said, her tone dripping with sarcasm as she ran one manicured finger along the dresser top. "And how is my dear ex-husband's health these days? I heard he made a remarkable recovery, quite unexpected given what the doctors said about his condition being terminal and irreversible." The way she emphasized those last words made Halima's blood run cold, and she suddenly understood that she was standing in a room with someone who might be a murderer, someone who had expected old Haji Musa to die and who might now realize that her plan had failed. Halima's hand instinctively moved to her still fat stomach where a 3-month-old life was growing, a secret she and old Haji Musa had decided to keep hidden until she was safely into her second trimester, but now she wondered if keeping secrets was the most dangerous choice she could have made. "He is well, Ma. Very well. Praise God for his recovery," Halima managed to say, backing slowly toward the door while trying not to show her fear, but Zainab's eyes had sharpened with an intelligence that suggested she knew far more than she was revealing. "Praise God indeed," Zainab murmured, moving to block Halima's path to the door with a casual step that felt anything but casual, "and praise be the faithful servant who stand by their employers through sickness and health, who perhaps grow even closer to them during times of vulnerability and need." The implication in her words was clear, and Halima realized with growing horror that Zainab somehow knew about the baby, about the arrangement, about everything that was supposed to remain private. Before Halima could respond, Zainab's phone rang, and she answered it with her eyes still locked on Halima's face, speaking in low, urgent Hausa that Halima could understand perfectly. "Yes, he's still alive. No, I don't know why it didn't work. Something went wrong. We need to handle this quickly before he changes his will again or does something stupid like legitimizing a child with one of his workers." Halima felt the room spin around her as the full weight of the danger crashed over her like a wave, understanding now that she wasn't just carrying evidence of attempted murder in her pocket, but also carrying in her womb the very thing that made her a target for someone willing to kill to secure an inheritance worth billions of naira. Now, the real question isn't just who poisoned old Haji Musa, but whether Halima can protect herself and her unborn child from becoming the next victims. What would you do in Halima's position? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button because next chapter is going to reveal secrets that will shock you to your core. Halima didn't remember running from Zainab's old bedroom, but she found herself in the kitchen garden behind the mansion, her chest heaving as she crouched behind the hibiscus bushes that Chef Amaka had planted last spring to provide fresh flowers for old Haji Musa's breakfast table. The afternoon sun beat down on Lagos with the intensity that came just before the rainy season, and sweat mixed with tears on her face as she tried to process everything that had crashed into her world in the span of 15 minutes. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out with shaking hands to see a text from Amina. "Girl, you haven't called me in 2 weeks. Is everything okay with the pregnancy? Have you told him yet that you're having feelings for him beyond the arrangement?" Halima almost laughed at the absurdity of the message, because yes, she had developed feelings for old Haji Musa over the past 6 months, feelings that went far beyond gratitude or duty. Feelings that had grown from watching him recover and seeing the gentle way he'd started looking at her, the way he'd insisted she eat her meals at the main dining table instead of the kitchen, the way he'd held her hand last week and whispered that maybe God had given him a second chance at life for a reason. But those feelings seemed meaningless now in the face of murder plots and death threats, and she realized with crushing certainty that loving a billionaire came with dangers she had never imagined when she was just a village girl dreaming of a better life in the big city. She needed to tell old Haji Musa about the vial, about Zainab's phone conversation, about the danger they were both in, but fear paralyzed her as she considered all the ways this could go wrong. What if he didn't believe her? What if he thought she was making up stories to drive a wedge between him and his ex-wife? What if Zainab had allies in the house, other staff members who were loyal to her because she'd hired them years ago when she was still the madam of the mansion? Halima thought about Ibrahim, the head of security, who had worked for the family for 15 years and who still spoke fondly of Zainab's generosity during the holidays. She thought about Adana, the head housekeeper, who had been Zainab's personal assistant before the divorce and who sometimes looked at Halima with barely concealed contempt, as if she blamed her for being young and available when Al-Haji Musa was vulnerable and alone. The mansion that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a trap, and Halima understood that she couldn't trust anyone except perhaps Chef Amaka, who had arrived only a year ago and who had no connection to Zainab's reign as a lady of the house. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from an unknown number, and when she answered with a hesitant hello, a woman's voice spoke in crisp English with an accent that suggested expensive education abroad. "Miss Halima, I know what you found in that bedroom. I know what you heard. And I know you're carrying old Haji Musa's child. So listen very carefully if you want to survive the next 48 hours. The voice on the phone belonged to someone who introduced herself as Hoa, claiming to be old Haji Musa's younger sister, who had been disinherited 15 years ago after she'd refused an arranged marriage and chosen to become a lawyer instead of a submissive wife to a business associate of their father's company. "I've been investigating my brother's illness for months," Hoa explained, her voice urgent and low as if she too was hiding somewhere while making this call. "I suspected poison from the beginning because I'd seen similar symptoms in a case I worked on involving a businessman whose wife tried to kill him slowly with arsenic derivatives mixed into his medication." She told Halima that she'd been gathering evidence against Zainab and her current boyfriend, a man named Daughter who had gambling debts of over 50 million naira and who stood to gain everything if Zainab inherited Musa's estate as his closest surviving family member since they'd never officially finalized some property settlements from the divorce. Zainab knew about the cancer clause in their divorce agreement. Hoa continued, and Halima listened with growing horror as she learned that if Haji Musa died of natural causes before remarrying or having children, a significant portion of his wealth would revert to Zainab as a death benefit that his lawyers had included to ensure she'd be cared for if he predeceased her. But if he has a legitimate child, everything changes, which is why your pregnancy makes you the most dangerous person in Zainab's world right now, Hoa said, her words confirming Halima's worst fears about the target she becomes simply by agreeing to help a dying man leave a legacy. Hoa insisted they meet that evening at a restaurant in Lekki, a public place where Zainab's people couldn't make a move without witnesses, and she promised to bring evidence that would not only save Halima's life but also put Zainab behind bars for attempted murder. Halima agreed to the meeting and ended the call, but before she could catch her breath, she heard voices coming from the main house, raised and angry in a way that was unusual for the normally peaceful mansion. She crept closer to the back entrance and heard Haji Musa shouting, his voice strong and furious in a way she'd never heard before. "You have no right to be in this house. Zainab, the divorce gave you the property in Abuja and the shares in the telecommunications company, but this home is mine and you are not welcome here without an invitation." Zainab's response was cold and calculated, her voice carrying the edge of someone who believed they held all the power. "I came to check on you, Musa, to see if the rumors were true that you made a miraculous recovery from an illness that 3 specialists said would kill you within months, and imagine my surprise to find your little maid cleaning my old bedroom, looking guilty as sin, as if she'd been snooping through things that don't concern her." Halima heard the threat in those words, the accusation designed to make Haji Musa doubt her intentions, and she knew she had to act quickly before Zainab could poison his mind against her the way she'd literally poisoned his body. She pulled the tissue-wrapped vial pieces from her pocket, steeled herself with a deep breath, and walked into the house through the kitchen entrance, moving toward the sound of arguing voices with evidence that would either save them or get her killed before sunset. She entered the main living room where Haji Musa stood facing Zainab, his tall frame radiating anger while his ex-wife looked cool and collected in her designer outfit. But both of them turned to stare at Halima as she approached with the wrapped vial pieces held in her outstretched hand. "Haji," Halima said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I found something today while cleaning, something I think you need to see. Something that explains why you were dying 6 months ago and why you suddenly got better when certain people stopped visiting this house regularly." She unwrapped the tissue to reveal the broken glass and the partially visible label. watching as Haji Musa's face changed from confusion to shock to a rage so intense that she actually stepped back in fear. He took the pieces with trembling hands, reading the label over and over as if he couldn't believe what his eyes were showing him, and then he turned to Zainab with a look that could have melted steel. "You poisoned me. You came to my hospital room and cried over my bedside, and all the while you were the reason I was dying. You were killing me slowly so you could inherit my wealth and run off with that useless boyfriend of yours who everyone knows is drowning in gambling debts." Zainab's mask of composure finally cracked, and Halima saw something dangerous flash in her eyes as she hissed, "You can't prove anything with broken glass and accusations from a servant girl who's probably trying to secure her own position in your bed and your will." But before anyone could respond, the lights in the mansion suddenly went out, plunging the room into darkness, and Halima heard the sound of footsteps rushing toward them from multiple directions, heavy and purposeful, and she realized that Zainab hadn't come alone, that whatever was about to happen had been planned, and that they were all in more danger than she'd ever imagined. The question now isn't whether Halima can prove Zainab's guilt, but whether any of them will survive long enough to see justice served. What do you think Zainab's next move will be? Share your predictions in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because next chapter is going to take this story to a whole new level of intensity. The darkness lasted only seconds before the backup generator kicked in, but those seconds felt like an eternity to Halima as she heard bodies moving, glass breaking, and Haji Musa's voice shouting for Ibrahim and the security team. When the lights flickered back on, Zainab was gone. The front door stood wide open, and three men Halima had never seen before were restraining Haji Musa, while a fourth man, someone she recognized as daughter from photos she'd seen in old society magazines, stood in the doorway with a gun pointed casually in their direction. "Nobody needs to get hurt today," daughter said, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of someone who believed he'd already won. "We just need Haji Musa to sign a few documents transferring some assets to settle outstanding divorce issues, and then we'll be on our way and everyone can go back to their normal lives." Halima's mind raced as she calculated the distance to the kitchen where Chef Amaka kept his phone charging near the spice rack, wondering if she could make it there to call the police before daughter decided that witnesses were too dangerous to leave alive. Haji Musa struggled against the men holding him, his face contorted with rage and betrayal as he spat out words in Hausa that roughly translated accusations about daughter's parentage and his certain destination in the afterlife. "Where's Zainab?" Haji Musa demanded, switching to English. "Where is that witch who tried to kill me so she could steal everything I built from nothing while she was sitting in her father's mansion being groomed to marry money instead of own it?" Daughter's smile was cold and reptilian as he replied, "My woman is somewhere safe, making sure certain evidence disappears and certain people forget they saw anything today. Because you see, Haji, you're not the only one who can buy loyalty in this city." The sound of sirens in the distance made everyone in the room freeze, and Halima realized that someone had called the police, perhaps one of the neighbors who had heard the commotion, or maybe Ibrahim, who she'd underestimated as being complicit in Zainab's schemes. Daughter's casual demeanor cracked, and he moved toward Haji Musa with the gun now pointed directly at his chest, his voice urgent and threatening. "Sign the papers now. Old man, transfer the Lekki properties and the offshore account to the shell company we set up, or I swear I'll put a bullet in you and claim it was self-defense during a robbery." But Haji Musa just laughed, a sound so devoid of humor that it made Halima's skin crawl, and he said something that changed everything. "You think I'm afraid of death, daughter? I already died once when I believed I had no legacy, no future, no reason to fight for another day. But God gave me a second chance and a reason to live that's worth more than all the money you're trying to steal." His eyes found Halima's across the room, and in that moment she understood that he knew about the baby, had perhaps always known or suspected, and the look he gave her was filled with something that transcended their arrangement and touched on something deeper, something real. The sirens grew louder, and daughter made a decision that would haunt Halima's nightmares for months to come. He grabbed her by the arm, yanked her toward him with brutal force, and pressed the gun against her temple while backing toward the door. "She comes with me as insurance," he announced, his arm locked around Halima's throat so tightly she could barely breathe. "And if anyone tries to follow, or if those police cars come through this gate, I'll kill her and the baby she's carrying before you can blink." The revelation that daughter knew about her pregnancy sent ice through Halima's veins, and she realized that Zainab had told him everything, had turned the most intimate secret into a weapon that could now be used to destroy them all. Haji Musa's face went pale, and she saw him make a calculation behind his eyes, weighing her life against his pride, his wealth against her safety, and she wanted to scream at him not to give in, not to let these criminals win. But the words wouldn't come because daughter's arm was cutting off her air supply. "Let her go," Haji Musa said, his voice breaking in a way that revealed more emotion than Halima had ever heard from the usually stoic businessman. "Take whatever you want. I'll sign anything. Transfer everything. Just please don't hurt her or the baby. They're innocent in all of this." His willingness to surrender everything he'd built broke something inside Halima, and she felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that this man, who she'd agreed to help out of pity and obligation, had somehow become the person she cared about more than her own safety. The men holding Haji Musa released him and pulled out papers from a briefcase one of them had been carrying, clearly prepared for this exact scenario, and Halima watched in horror as daughter forced her to stand beside Haji Musa while he signed away properties worth hundreds of millions of naira. Each signature felt like a nail in the coffin of justice, and she wanted to tell him to stop, to fight, to do anything except give these criminals exactly what they wanted, but the gun pressed against her head was a persuasive argument for compliance. The police sirens had stopped, and Halima realized with sinking dread that perhaps daughter had been right about buying loyalty, that perhaps the police who should have been their salvation had been paid to stay outside the gates or to delay their response until the criminals could escape. But then something unexpected happened. Chef Amaka burst through the kitchen door wielding a large pot of boiling Stockport water, and he threw it with surprising accuracy at daughter's gun hand, causing the man to scream and drop the weapon as his skin blistered from the heat. The moment of chaos that followed was a blur of motion as Haji Musa lunged for the dropped gun, as Halima stumbled away from daughter's grasp, and as the men who had been acting his muscles suddenly seemed uncertain whether their payment was worth facing an armed and furious billionaire. Two of them ran for the door, abandoning daughter who was clutching his burned hand and screaming curses, while the third one made the mistake of trying to grab the briefcase with the signed papers and found himself face to face with Ibrahim and 4 other security guards who came flooding into the room with batons and pepper spray. The tide had turned in seconds, and Halima found herself pulled into Haji Musa's arms as he shielded her body with his own, the gun now pointed at daughter who was on his knees crying from pain and fear. "Where's Zainab?" Haji Musa demanded again, his voice cold and deadly as he pressed the gun against daughter's temple in a mirror of what had been done to Halima moments before. "Tell me where she is, or I swear I'll do to you what you threatened to do to the woman carrying my child." Daughter broke quickly, giving up an address in Oja where Zainab was supposedly waiting with money and passports for their planned escape to Dubai, and within minutes the actual police were finally entering the mansion, called by Chef Amaka, who had used his kitchen phone while everyone else was focused on the confrontation in the living room. As the police led daughter away in handcuffs and took statements from everyone present, Halima sat on the sofa with her hand protectively over her stomach, trying to process how quickly her life had shifted from quiet domesticity to life-threatening danger and back again. Haji Musa sat beside her, and when he took her hand in his, she noticed it was shaking despite his outward calm, and she realized that he'd been just as terrified as she was, that his willingness to give up everything had been real and not just a tactical play. "I meant what I said," he whispered, his voice for her ears only in the chaos of police officers and statements and security footage being reviewed. "You and this baby are worth more than all the money in all my accounts, and I was ready to lose everything if it meant keeping you safe." His words should have comforted her, but instead they terrified her because she understood now that loving someone in this world of wealth and danger meant being vulnerable, meant being a target, meant accepting that people would always want to take what you had. Before she could respond, one of the police officers approached with a grim expression and information that made Halima's blood run cold. "Sir, we sent units to the Oja address, but when they arrived, the house was empty except for evidence of a struggle, blood on the floor, and signs that someone left in a hurry, possibly injured, possibly taken by force." The implication was clear. Zainab had either escaped or been betrayed by her own accomplices, and either scenario meant that the danger wasn't over, that somewhere in Lagos, a desperate woman with nothing left to lose was planning her next move, and that move would almost certainly target the one thing standing between her and the inheritance she believed she deserved, Halima and the baby growing inside her. Is Zainab on the run, or is she planning an even deadlier revenge? The truth is more twisted than you think. Drop a like if this story has you hooked, and hit that subscribe button because Chapter 4 will reveal secrets that change everything you thought you knew about this case. The safe house in Ikoyi was smaller than Halima expected, a two-bedroom apartment on the 8th floor of a building where Alhaji Musa's personal lawyer, Barrister Okonkwo, kept properties for clients who needed to disappear for a while. Halima sat by the window watching the Lagos skyline fade into evening, her hand resting on her stomach where their baby, was growing despite all the chaos trying to tear their world apart. It had been 3 days since the attack at the mansion, 3 days of police investigations and media frenzy as news outlets reported on the dramatic attempted robbery and assault on one of Nigeria's wealthiest businessmen. The official story said nothing about poison or murder plots or ex-wives with vendettas, because Alhaji Musa's lawyers had carefully crafted a narrative that protected everyone's reputation while the real investigation continued in secret. But Halima knew the truth behind the sanitized press releases, knew that somewhere in the city, Zainab was still free, still dangerous, and still desperate to silence anyone who could testify about her crimes. Alhaji Musa had insisted on staying at the safe house with her, refusing to return to the mansion until Zainab was found, and his presence in the small apartment had forced him into an intimacy that went far beyond their original arrangement of a simple surrogacy for a dying man's legacy. They'd spent the past 3 days talking in ways they never had before, sharing stories about their childhoods, their fears, their dreams for the future, and Halima had discovered layers to this billionaire that she'd never seen when she was just as maid cleaning his house and serving his meals. He told her about growing up poor in Kano, about hawking groundnuts and pure water on dusty streets while his wealthy cousins attended expensive schools, and mocked his mother for being a trader instead of a housewife, and she heard in his voice the same hunger for respect and dignity that had driven her to flee her village rather than submit to an arranged marriage. Their conversations often stretched into the night, and last evening he confessed something that made her heart ache with complicated emotions. When the doctors told me I was dying, I felt relief more than fear, because I realized I'd built an empire but forgotten to build a life, forgotten to find love or connection or purpose beyond accumulating wealth to prove to everyone who dismissed me that I was worth something. His honesty had broken down the final wall between them, and Halima had admitted her own truth. I agreed to have your baby because I was grateful and because you were dying and it seemed like a kindness I could offer. But somewhere along the way, while watching you fight to survive and seeing how you treated me with respect even when you were at your weakest, I started to feel things I never expected to feel. Things that scared me because I'm just a village girl and you're a man who moves in circles I can't even imagine. He'd reached for her hand then, his touch gentle despite the strength she knew he possessed, and he'd said words that changed everything. You're not just a village girl, Halima. You're the woman who saw me as human when everyone else saw me as either a wallet or a corpse, and I want you to know that this baby we're having isn't just about legacy anymore. It's about building a family with someone who makes me want to be better than just rich and successful. The moment had felt suspended in time, and Halima had seen in his eyes something she'd been afraid to name. Love, real and complicated, and growing despite all the violence and danger surrounding them. But before they could explore what those feelings meant, Barrister Okonkwo had arrived with news that shattered their fragile peace. We found Zainab, the lawyer announced, his expression grave as he entered the safe house with 2 folders of documents that he placed on the dining table with a weight of evidence that could destroy lives. But you're not going to like what we discovered about her situation or about why she was so desperate to see you dead, Alhaji. The story that emerged from those documents was more complex than simple greed, and Halima found herself almost pitying the woman who'd tried to kill the man she'd once married in a church ceremony attended by 2,000 guests. Zainab had been forced into bankruptcy after the divorce, her father's import-export business collapsing due to corruption investigations and frozen assets, leaving her with nothing but the properties and shares Musa had given her in the settlement. She'd invested heavily in daughter's supposed tech startup, not knowing he was actually running a Ponzi scheme that defrauded hundreds of investors, and when that house of cards collapsed, she'd been left with debts exceeding 300 million naira and creditors who weren't polite about collecting. She saw your illness as an opportunity, Barrister Okonkwo explained, pulling out bank statements showing payments to a pharmacy technician who provided the poisoning agent. And when you survived and showed signs of recovery, she panicked because she'd already spent money she didn't have based on the assumption that you'd die and she'd inherit enough to cover her debts and escape to Dubai with daughter. The revelation added layers of desperation to Zainab's actions, transforming her from a pure villain into a woman who'd made terrible choices while drowning in circumstances that had spiraled beyond her control. Where is she now? Haji Musa asked, his voice tight with emotion that Halima couldn't quite read, and the lawyer's answer was not what any of them expected. She's in the hospital at Lagos University Teaching Hospital, in the intensive care unit, after attempting suicide yesterday when she realized the police were closing in and daughter had already fled the country with the loss of her money, Barrister Okonkwo said, and Halima watched Haji Musa's face cycle through shock, anger, and something that looked surprisingly like grief. They drove to the hospital that evening despite the lawyer's protests about safety and wisdom, and Halima found herself walking through sterile corridors toward a room where a woman who tried to kill them both was fighting for her own life. The woman in the hospital bed looked nothing like the polished, confident person who'd confronted Halima in the mansion bedroom just days ago. Instead, she was frail and broken, with tubes running from her arms and a breathing machine helping her damaged body process oxygen. When Zainab's eyes fluttered open and focused on Haji Musa standing at the foot of her bed, tears began streaming down her face, and she whispered something in Hausa that Halima translated mentally. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never wanted any of this. I just didn't know what else to do." The scene was so pathetic, so far removed from the danger and drama of the past week, that Halima felt her anger draining away despite everything this woman had done to them. Haji Musa stood silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his words surprised everyone in that room. "I'm going to pay your debts, Zainab, all of them, and I'm going to make sure you get treatment and therapy and a chance to rebuild your life, not because you deserve my mercy, but because holding on to hatred will poison me worse than anything you put in my tea." His decision was met with protest from Barrister Okonkwo, who argued that showing mercy to someone who tried to commit murder was foolish and dangerous, but Haji Musa was unmoved in his conviction that forgiveness was the only path forward that wouldn't destroy his soul. "I'm not forgetting what she did," he said as they left the hospital, his hand finding Halima's in the parking lot as if anchoring himself to something real and good, "and she'll still have to face legal consequences for her actions, but I won't let her desperation and poor choices turn me into someone who values revenge over compassion." Walking back to the car, Halima felt something shift inside her, a recognition that this man she was having a baby with possessed a kind of strength that had nothing to do with money or power and everything to do with character forged through his own experiences of poverty and dismissal. But their moment of reflection was shattered when Barrister Okonkwo received a call that made his face go pale, and he turned to them with news that proved the danger was far from over. Daughter has been arrested at the airport in Abuja trying to board a flight to Morocco, and is telling police that Zainab wasn't the only person involved in the poisoning plot, that there's someone else, someone with access to the house who was helping them, someone who's still there and who might be the most dangerous player in this whole deadly game. Who is the insider that betrayed Haji Musa from within his own home? The answer will shock you. Smash that like button and subscribe, because Chapter 5 is the explosive finale you won't want to miss. The revelation that someone inside the mansion had been helping Zainab, and daughter sent them racing back to the estate with police escort. Halima's heart pounding as she considered every member of the staff who might have betrayed them. Haji Musa's jaw was set in grim determination, and she could see he was running through the same mental calculations, weighing years of trust against the evidence of betrayal that daughter had apparently provided to prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. When they arrived at the mansion, they found the entire staff assembled in the main hall under police supervision, faces ranging from confused to terrified as they tried to understand why they were being treated like suspects in their own workplace. Detective Adebayo, the lead investigator on the case, stood at the front with a tablet showing security footage and bank records, and his voice was professional but cold as he addressed the room. "One of you has been receiving payments of 50,000 naira monthly for the past 8 months from an account linked to Zainab Musa, and that same person was responsible for ensuring that poison medication reached Haji Musa's bedroom, and that certain security cameras were disabled at Crucial. Times. The silence that followed was suffocating, and Halima scanned the faces of people she'd worked alongside for 3 years, trying to spot guilt or fear or any sign of who could have done this terrible thing. Her eyes passed over Chef Amaka, who'd saved their lives with his quick thinking, over the gardeners and cleaning staff who'd always been kind to her, and finally landed on Adana, the head housekeeper, whose face was carefully neutral in a way that immediately raised Halima's suspicions. Detective Adebayo continued his presentation, pulling up bank statements that showed regular deposits into an account belonging to someone who'd worked in the household for over a decade, someone who'd had access to every room and every routine, someone who'd been perfectly positioned to facilitate murder while maintaining an appearance of loyal service. The account belongs to Ibrahim Okafor, the detective announced, and Halima felt her world tilt as she looked at the head of security who'd worked for Alhaji Musa for 15 years, who'd been there through a marriage to Zainab and the divorce and the illness, who'd seemed like the most trustworthy person in the entire household. Ibrahim's face crumbled as all eyes turned to him, and he began shaking his head violently, his voice rising in panicked denial. No, this is wrong. I never took money from Madam Zainab. I never helped anyone poison Alhaji. You have to believe me. Someone is setting me up. But the evidence was damning. Footage showing him accepting envelope from a man later identified as daughter's associate, testimony from the pharmacy technician naming him as a person who provided information about Alhaji Musa's medication schedule, and phone records showing dozens of calls between his number and Zainab's private line during the months when Musa was deteriorating. Why, Ibrahim? Alhaji Musa's voice cracked with betrayal as he confronted the man he'd trusted to protect his life. I paid you well. I treated you like family. I sent your children to good schools and gave you bonuses every year. So why would you help my ex-wife kill me? The answer that came was not what anyone expected, and it revealed depths of resentment that had been festering beneath the surface of professional courtesy for over a decade. Because you took everything from my family. Ibrahim shouted, his composure finally shattering as years of hidden anger poured out in a torrent of accusations and pain. My father worked for your company for 30 years, building your warehouses and managing your logistics until you restructured and fired him without pension or compensation, and he died broken, bitter while you got richer and richer. The revelation hit Alhaji Musa like a physical blow, and Halima watched him stagger back as he processed this information, clearly searching his memory for the incident Ibrahim described. Your father was Okafor from the Apapa warehouse? Musa asked, his voice barely above a whisper, and when Ibrahim nodded with tears streaming down his face, understanding and horror dawned on the billionaire's features. That restructuring happened 15 years ago when we were losing money and I had to make hard choices to save the company from bankruptcy, and I remember your father was let go. But I didn't handle it personally. My operations manager at the time was supposed to ensure everyone got severance packages and pension payments. The excuse sounded hollow even to Halima's ears, and she understood that intent mattered less than impact when someone's life had been destroyed by corporate decisions made in boardrooms far removed from the human consequences. Ibrahim's laugh was bitter and broken as he responded, Your operations manager kept the severance money for himself and blamed my father for equipment theft to justify the termination without benefits. And by the time we realized what had happened and tried to fight it, the company's lawyers buried us in paperwork and delays until my father gave up and drank himself to death. The tragedy of it was overwhelming, and Halima felt tears on her face as she witnessed two men destroyed by circumstances and choices that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. So when Madam Zainab approached me 2 years ago after her divorce, crying about how you destroyed her life and taken everything she'd built with you, I saw an opportunity for justice, Ibrahim continued, his voice steadying as he told his story to the room full of witnesses who would seal his fate. She promised that if I helped her secure her inheritance, she'd give me enough money to finally take care of my mother and sisters and clear my father's name. The confession was complete, and the police moved to arrest him, but Alhaji Musa held up a hand to stop them, his face transformed by an emotion that Halima recognized as profound regret mixed with determination. "Detective, I want to speak with Ibrahim privately before you take him away," Musa said, his voice carrying an authority that police couldn't refuse, and within minutes they were alone in the study where this entire nightmare had begun 6 months ago when a billionaire collapsed believing he was dying. "I can't undo what happened to your father, Ibrahim, and I can't excuse what you did to me in response to that injustice. But I can tell you that I understand why a good man might make terrible choices when pushed beyond his breaking point by grief and poverty. Haji Musa pulled out his phone and made a call to his current operations manager, instructing them to pull files on the Okafor termination case from 15 years ago and to prepare a posthumous settlement package that would compensate Ibrahim's family for the pension and severance that should have been paid. You will still have to face criminal charges for your role in the poisoning plot, Musa told Ibrahim, whose face showed shock at this unexpected mercy. But I'll make sure your family is taken care of and that your father's name is cleared in the company records, because I'm learning that holding people accountable doesn't mean forgetting their humanity. The moment was interrupted by Halima suddenly gasping and doubling over in pain, her hand flying to her stomach as cramping seized her abdomen with intensity that made her vision blur. "The baby," she managed to say before her legs gave out, and then there were hands catching her, voices shouting for ambulances, and the world became a confused rush of movement and fear. She woke in a hospital room with bright lights and the steady beep of monitors, and her first conscious thought was terror that she'd lost a child that had become so much more than a dying man's legacy. But then she felt Haji Musa's hand gripping Hayes, and she heard the doctor's calm voice saying, "The baby is fine. You had a stress-induced episode that caused cramping but no actual complications, though we want to keep you overnight for observation." Relief flooded through her so intensely that she started crying, and Musa leaned down to press his forehead against Hayes, whispering, "I thought I'd lost you both. I thought my past mistakes and all this violence had finally caught up to destroy the only good thing in my life." Over the next hours, as she rested and recovered, they talked about everything, about the baby growing inside her, about the future they wanted to build together, about how they would navigate the complicated reality of being a couple formed under extraordinary circumstances. "I want to marry you, Halima," he said as dawn light began filtering through the hospital window, "not because of the baby or obligation or gratitude, but because you've shown me what it means to love someone for who they are rather than what they can give me." His proposal was simple and honest, without the grand gestures that his wealth could have provided, and Halima understood that this was a real man beneath the billionaire persona, someone who'd learned that money couldn't buy the things that actually mattered. 6 months later, Halima stood in the nursery of the mansion that had almost become her tomb, holding her daughter Aisha in her arms while sunlight streamed through windows that had been reinforced with better security, but remained open to let in fresh air and hope. Haji Musa, her husband now, after a simple Islamic ceremony attended by a family from Kano and his reconciled relatives who'd learned to accept his choices, stood beside her, his hand gently touching their daughter's tiny fingers. Zainab had been sentenced to 5 years in prison, but was receiving treatment for her mental health issues and had written a letter apologizing for her actions, a letter that Halima had read and then carefully filed away as part of a past they were choosing to learn from rather than be destroyed by. Ibrahim was serving 3 years but had been enrolled in educational programs, and his family was receiving the compensation that Musa had promised, turning tragedy into something resembling restoration. The mansion had new staff, new security systems, and new energy that came from being a home rather than just a display of wealth. "Do you ever regret agreeing to help a dying man?" Musa asked her, his voice soft so as not to wake the sleeping baby, and Halima considered the question with the wisdom of someone who'd survived attempted murder, betrayal, and circumstances that should have destroyed her. "I regret the pain and danger we went through," she answered honestly, "but I don't regret you, or us, or this beautiful life we're building from the ashes of all those mistakes and tragedies." She turned to face him fully, this man who'd transformed from her employer to the father of her child to her partner in every sense of the word. "We both made choices driven by fear and desperation, but somehow God used those imperfect choices to bring us together and teach us what really matters." Outside the nursery window, Lagos continued its chaotic dance of traffic and commerce, millions of people pursuing their own dreams and making their own mistakes. But inside this room there was peace, hard-won and precious, the kind that only comes from surviving the worst and choosing forgiveness over bitterness. Their story would be told in different ways by different people, as a scandal, as a romance, as a cautionary tale about the dangers of wealth. But for Halima and Musa, it was simply their truth, messy and imperfect and ultimately hopeful, Proof that even the darkest circumstances could give birth to light if you were brave enough to choose love over fear and mercy over revenge. And there you have it, a story of betrayal, survival, and the kind of love that's forged in fire. What lesson hit you hardest from Halima and Musa's journey? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, show some love by liking and subscribing for more powerful tales that prove love and forgiveness can triumph even in the darkest circumstances.